Whether you're a warfighter, a first responder, a podcast listener, or anyone with a phone, a fast, reliable, and secure connection matters to you. The digital connectivity depends on real-world infrastructure, from cell towers to fiber optic cables, data centers to satellites. Today, we're going to take a dive into the next generation of wireless tech that is so important to our economy and national security. Welcome to IQT Explains, a series on the IQT Podcast where we explore global technology trends and their impact on national security and commercial innovation. I'm Pat Mitchell, your guest host for today's podcast, and in this edition, we'll discuss the sixth generation of wireless communications, otherwise known as 6G, how we've gotten here to this point, what it may look like, and why it matters. And for this conversation, I'm joined by two great guests. First, my colleague Nate. Dr. Nathan Roberts is a senior technical architect at IQT, where he focuses on next-generation comms, compute, sensing, and microelectronics. Before coming to IQT, Nate has consulted for early-stage startups, worked as an engineer for Lattice Semiconductor, and was VP of Engineering at Everactive. Welcome, Nate.
Thanks, Pat. Good to be here.
And next, we're really lucky to be joined by Dr. Tom Rondeau. Tom is Principal Director for the DoD's FutureG office, serving in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, R&E, where he's responsible for programs to advance warfighting capabilities that use future generation wireless technologies. He came to this role by way of DARPA, the GNU Radio Project, University of Pennsylvania, and the IDA Center on Communications Research in Princeton, New Jersey. Tom, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Really glad to be here.
All right. Well, before we start talking about FutureG, let's talk a bit about past G. Tom has agreed to play the role of historian for a minute. So there's been 5 generations of cellular technologies that have come before 6G, if my math's right on that. So Tom, can you tell us a bit about how we got to where we are today?
Yeah, so mobile communications really kicked off in the 60s, but it was really kind of proven out for portable, handheld mobility in the late 70s and 80s. Started the what we call first generation. Nobody really terms it 1G. It was a thing called AMPS at the time, and this was the famous brick phone. We all remember Zack Snyder from Saved by the Bell days. That was that type of phone. Then in the 90s, what was happening was trying to figure out how to create a global standard around this mobile technology to help with issues of roaming between countries and so on. So the global system came out called GSM, and that's the 2G, and we really started to define what the Gs were. What I like to think about as we're moving through these generations is what's the actual killer app of a generation. So in 1G, like I said, it was this analog system. Turns out it was very easy to spoof numbers and spoof people's access to the network. So the killer app was drug dealers. They made hay by spoofing numbers and not getting arrested. Watch The Wire, for instance. 2G, everybody thought that the killer app for 2G was the universal, worldwide standard, but really, and for voice. And 2G made a great technology for voice, and the market was awesome. But what the killer app really turned out to be was text messaging, like SMS. Then you move in where you start doing text over it. You start thinking about how you could do data over these networks. So we moved into 3G, where 3G was supposed to be the focus on data. Also, there was still some more universal alignments of things. So the killer app for 3G was supposed to be data. Turned out the killer app for 3G was the iPhone, because it literally killed the network with how much data it was trying to push over that system. And so 4G comes along as the way to fix that and really provide universal high-speed broadband data service. And that one, the killer app for that turned out to be the App Store. And we've made great gains and that's awesome stuff because of that. So then you now get into this 5G era, which was what we're in now. And there's a whole lot to talk about what we predicted to be 5G, what it is, and so on. But that's kind of how we got to this point, was just that incremental development of new idea to rolling out a technology that worked well. 5G is a new idea, and that's, again, why we're talking here about that, and 6G, which is how we're going to actually kind of smooth some of these things out and make a really compelling technology. But that's where we are, and there's lots more to dive into in those last bits that we can get into during this conversation.
Really useful. Thank you so much, Tom. Nate, anything you'd add to that lesson?
Yeah, I had 2 things I wanted to touch on, and Tom, I'd be curious your opinion of these. One thing I've heard a lot is that kind of plays out. Some of the odd number Gs are a bit of a early kind of growing pains type of a thing, and then the even number G kind of really pushes that into volume and the masses. I think your example of 3G with the iPhone, but then 4G was the thing that brought us, the glory days, which is Netflix on our phone.
Yeah, yeah.
How do you look at that from like a 5G to 6G? What are we going to see there?
Yeah, you're giving me an opening for a joke that I created back in 2017 when we were all had stars in our eyes about 5G, and I made this comment that if you think about the G's, so the way that we just walked through them, you're right. The odds tend not to be great technology, but they kind of prove out a market, and then the evens tend to make that work. And so I had this joke that cellular generations are like Star Trek movies, only the even ones are good. And so Star Trek 6, luckily, is the undiscovered country. So that's what we get to think about with what 6G could become. Like I said, it was a very unpopular joke when I made it in 2017, but now it seems to be kind of common knowledge or kind of common adage in the business. But yeah, the revolutionary idea of 5G was that we could softwareize the entire system, or as much of the system as possible. So we're pushing towards these systems that are commodity off-the-shelf computing systems to run a great portion of the networks, some specialization near the edge, because the closer you get to the antenna, the harder the math gets, and the more processing you have to do. But we're still pushing more software towards the antenna. And that antenna is just that interface between the analog wireless world and the digital worlds of how all the communication systems work. So that software revolution of 5G with software-defined radio and software-defined networking and cloud computing as the back end for a lot of what's going on there, that was a digital transformation of the telecommunications industry. And that's what you see happen here, is that you first have to effectively develop internal to the industry, so the telecommunications providers and the network operators now better understand how to utilize these technologies. And then in 6G, we're going to start looking more out, and how do we make sure everybody knows how to use this digital transformed telecommunications infrastructure for their end user purposes. So that's one aspect of where we're going in 6G and why 5G is necessary, even though there's some warts and some challenges with it. But it is progressing nicely. We're learning a lot. It is working as a network system for what it needs to do. But really, it's helping us show the way and pave the way to these really cool applications that we're envisioning for 6G.
Yeah, and we're gonna dive a bunch more into 6G. And before we get too deep into the technology, Tom, I was just hoping to give our listeners a bit of background on the FutureG office and specifically what role your office plays in this landscape and perhaps what are some of your current priorities.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So, yeah, as you mentioned, I'm called the Principal Director of FutureG. It's Future Generation Wireless Technologies, just simplified to FutureG. So we're not captured by these generational terms, 5G, 6G, if there's going to be a 7G, if we need to name it that. So what I look at is as one of the 14 critical technology areas that were defined by the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, Ms. Heidi Shue. FutureG was one of those areas. And what we're looking at here is with all this history of the telecommunications world that we just went over, the benefits of watching commercial trends happen. And when there's a commercial motivation, i.e., can you make a lot of money off of it? Commercial industry knows how to do a really good job at solving those problems. Whereas the DoD, we solve very specific problems for very challenging RF environments, but we're not really dealing with how much data needs to flow around the DoD enterprise in times of peace, in the battlefield in times of war. All of this is changing rapidly, and the technology that commercial industry is producing is really compelling, and working with them now and how to pull that commercial technology more into DoD operations. So can we, two big questions that we have in this office are, can we manage the technology and miniaturize it? So we have this thing called SWAP, size, weight, and power. Can we get a low SWAP enough system that it can be deployed with our warfighters so they can take their cellular infrastructure and networks with them? And now you can imagine, instead of carrying routers and switches and cables, massive, like hundreds of pounds of cables, could you just bring one wireless base station, set it up, and connect everything in your forward operating base or even forward into the field? So that's question one. Can we take this technology with us into the field? Question two is, telecommunications industry has also created an incredible infrastructure around the globe. Can we successfully use it? We do use it every day, But we, of course, protect our data, and we can only do certain things on the public internet or over these public telecommunication systems. And especially when we're dealing with the looming giant of Huawei out of the People's Republic of China. And Huawei is a banned technology in the United States, but it is everywhere else in the world. And so can we securely utilize this infrastructure, and can we provide different risk analyses so commanders can provide their decisions and their intentions to their warfighting and peacekeeping efforts across the existing infrastructure? So to summarize, question one, can we deploy these systems ourselves? Question two, could we use existing infrastructure when we understand it and are secure enough to use it?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. That's really helpful. And yeah, sounds like when it comes to commercial tech, you're both trying to leverage it where you can and then shape it to where you're able to or need
Absolutely.
to. All right. So now let's turn to the future. And I think it's fair to say that a few of our listeners out there are likely users of cellular technology, as am I. So when I glance up into the corner of my phone, generally it seems like things download a bit faster when it says 5G compared to when it says 4G LTE. When 6G lands, what's this going to look like for me, the consumer? Am I going to see the 6G in the top corner of my phone? How might this change my life, and what's in it for me? And Nate, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, well, I think the short answer is yes. You'll see the 6G in the top right corner of your phone. It's a really good question, and I think it's a question that's kind of around the community right now as 6G begins to ramp up. Is like what exactly is this? I think we can look at it in a few different ways. So I'll kind of address it one maybe at a technical level, but then try to relate what that might mean to the consumer. Honestly, 6G, as we just talked about on kind of the roadmap of the Gs, if we look at the 5G, and I think Tom put it really well, this kind of software modernization of that 5G began, this should hit, more maturity, more volume. And I think that's very important. We want to get to a world where kind of the telco infrastructure is more flexible, more adaptable, more resilient. And the way to do that is to push more into software and kind of commoditize the hardware. That's just been a very flexible playbook. In addition, what it feels like is happening is we have various, call it types of communication. We have we have frequency bands that are used for common cellular communications. If you need higher performance, there are frequency bands, millimeter waves, so going up to 10 gigahertz that give you trade off range, but you get more performance. 6G is looking to up that even further, right? And then on kind of the flip side of that, you've got sensor networks where companies and industries are deploying lots of sensors that collect small bits of data, but are very energy constrained. So you've got these different types of communication where you need much lower power regimes, longer range, but they can be pretty low performance. So 6G embodies almost all of these aspects. What is terahertz wave? What does it mean to be ultra low power and energy efficient? And the 6G standard, will allow a lot of this to be kind of coordinated and interoperable. That is largely invisible to the consumer, at a technical level, but I think they will experience that through applications that are enabled. And I think that really is the key when the consumer comes in, just as we talked about the other Gs, what applications are going to be enabled? And I think you can actually kind of take the inverse of that. What consumer applications are going to demand more from the wireless service than is currently being provided? And to be honest, I don't think it's super clear. There were a lot of predictions in 5G that at least right now haven't been fully realized. Is there going to be a Netflix on your phone moment like we had in 4G in the consumer space? It's kind of TBD. People have said things like AR and VR and all that, but honestly, those really hitting mainstream are years out. So it's tough to say, and maybe in the absence of that catalyst that is just demanding something from the network that it didn't previously provide, 6G might just kind of march along and continue this modernization of the infrastructure, which honestly, I don't think is a bad thing at all. It's just not something a consumer will run to the store to buy a new phone for. Um, I'll I'll stop rambling in 1 minute, but I do want to leave kind of one comment, uh, and give an example where I think as a consumer you can look and see this playing out. Uh, you know 6G becoming more, and communication in general becoming a very, fundamental infrastructure. We can look at it like if anybody with an iPhone or Android, can think of their Photos app where you've got like years of photos on that thing. And, you know, some of the recent ones are stored on your phone. Some of the older ones, most of the older ones are out in the cloud in some, database somewhere in a data center. To the consumer, it doesn't matter. They just know they've got tons of photos, and it's pretty cool. I think as 5G and 6G evolve, we should see something kind of similar with the consumer, where they're using these different types of networks, but it's kind of invisible. They don't have to think about it. They don't have to worry about it. And I think we see that right now in one specific area. Which is the use of space and satellites for communication. Apple's come out and they say, you've got your phone, that's great. Here, now there's a satellite feature to it as well, but they're very distinct. You're out of cell context. You have to hold your phone up, wiggle it this way and that, and then you get, you can send, very, very sparse, kind of pre-baked messages.
Yeah, and I want to take this chance there to plug a great blog series that you and your team have put out on non-terrestrial networks, or NTNs, which is largely about satellite connectivity integrating with terrestrial wireless. But yeah, I noticed the same thing when I updated my iPhone recently. I actually read the overview of what was in the update, or at least part of it. And I actually did this. I didn't just make it up so I could say that I did it on the podcast. But yeah, it mentioned I have the ability now to send messages via satellite. It seems, like you said, Nate, fairly limited. Maybe takes 30 seconds. Obviously, you have to have a view of the sky, which makes sense. No photo, video. But yeah, it seems like it's really happening. So are you saying dead zones are going to be a thing of the past?
Well, and that's where it can trend to. Yeah, 4G and 5G, Earth-based networks, terrestrial ones, and then the satellite-based, the non-terrestrial, largely have lived independent. Recently, with 5G, they begin to integrate them, and 6G will further integrate that. So, as a consumer, what you could expect to see is that, especially if you're one who goes places that are more remote where you don't get as good a connectivity, you might not get Netflix, but you will be able to send texts and eventually get to things like voice. So again, is that the killer app? Don't know, but it is a convenience that will be very important to a lot of people. And I think it's an example of how this can evolve.
Yeah. Oh, thanks so much, Nate. Well, I want to bring Tom in here too. And I promise to stop using this podcast to get phone advice from two PhDs. But Tom, from a tech perspective, how do you expect 6G to be different from previous generations? Or what other components, as Nate was alluding to, do you think will be bigger parts of it?
Yeah, thanks. And Nate said some really great stuff there, and gave some examples there that I was thinking about too. The AR, VR, right? That was supposed to be a big thing, but there's so many issues with that technology still to before it's kind of mass marketable consumer. So let me still stay in the 5G era for a little bit more about what did 5G do for us as consumers. We get 5G on our phone. We hear all the great things that it can do. We can download an 8K video in 8 seconds, and then you start to ask, why would I want that? What does that actually do for me as a consumer? And frankly, will Netflix even serve that data fast enough for me to consume it? We can talk to our base stations faster on 5G connections than the base station will talk to most of the rest of the internet. So we've created excess resources here. We've created excess capacity in the data that we're consuming, and we also look at it. There's all these projections of exponential data use growth over the next few years. We haven't really seen a lot of data rate growth over the past few years. There was a big spike with COVID, and then we all kind of plateaued a little bit. Because we don't have apps that are driving, like applications that are driving more data to you as a user. Even with all the TikTok, whether or not we have it next year, still it's a huge part of the data flow on our networks, both more upload because a lot of people are more producing content. And so that 5G kind of helped with load balancing on the uplink versus downlink. But also, it really just created more capacity for all users to benefit simultaneously. So even if you don't think you're getting a faster connection with your 5G label on your phone versus your 4G, what's happening is everybody's having a better experience. So you can go to a massive rally or ball game or whatever, and everybody now is utilizing this, but because there's more capacity, everybody's having a better time. So it's kind of built a structure for everyone, and most of us don't even notice that. We kind of forget the days of when you were walking. I was at one of the rallies in DC. I live in DC, so there's lots of things happening there. Lots of crowds come in. Back in the 4G era, I wouldn't be able to get a connection. I wouldn't be able to get any text or data through. In the 5G era, we find that far less happening. And I think what Nate brings up with NTN is the next level of that is by not adding capacity, but adding coverage. And so now, you're going to notice less and less outages, and you're going to have a more seamless experience. And you may forget those days pretty quickly, and you say, what did 6G ever do for me? But it is creating a more functioning, working network. The other aspect that I like to think about is more about that Internet of Things type world. In the 5G era, we promised all these connected things, but those markets don't really exist yet. The technologies don't really exist. They haven't matured. And this is back to my description earlier. 5G was a transformation of the telco industry. 6G needs to be the transformation of the users of that telco infrastructure. And so as we're learning more about how these networks work, and we're building towards what these networks promise, novel ideas are going to come out, and new ways of using these networks are going to come out, and we're going to see the growth of these new products and markets happening, and they're already starting to happen. And this is one of the key differentiators that 5G's brought to the world, I should say cellular networks bring to the world versus, say, Wi-Fi. So a lot of the Internet of Things can just be done with Wi-Fi. Even if you do fixed wireless access, which is a big market in 5G, where instead of having fiber or cable to your house, you're really just getting a modem, user equipment sitting on your shelf or windowsill, and it's getting a 5G network into it, and then rebroadcasting. You're connecting internal to your apartment or house over Wi-Fi. So a lot of things we know can just connect to Wi-Fi, and that's great, but where the cellular networks really shine is when you need to have mobility, when you need to move a far enough distance or maybe indoors to outdoors, and connecting those things together becomes much more difficult on a Wi-Fi based system. Even if Wi-Fi is your last foot connection to the network, the overall network is going to be a more seamless infrastructure, and people who understand how to take advantage of that. And we're seeing this in factories, warehouses. A lot of agriculture in the future is going to be able to understand the scale of trying to manage those types of infrastructure and challenges. That's where a lot of these technologies are going to really shine, and that's what we're looking to see some innovations and inspirations from the entrepreneurs out there.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. And you brought up some of the industrial use cases. And one of the applications that I think I've heard both of you guys talk about in the past is this idea of integrated sensing and communications. So, Tom, I was going to ask if you could just explain that to the listeners first, and then if you see that playing a role in 6G among NTN, Softwarization, AI, et cetera.
Yeah, integrated sensing communications is a big one that we're looking at. So we just ISAC, integrated sensing communications. I'm just going to call it ISAC. So ISAC is an incredibly powerful concept. What it is because we have access to more spectrum. So they mentioned terahertz. So you're going way up there in the frequency bands. But as you understand how the physics of radio waves work, you can start doing really interesting things with them. We learned this early, World War I, World War II. We called it radar. where you ping something with RF energy, it reflects back, and you understand what's going on in the world around you. Now, of course, today we use that for ship management of ships and boats, automotive radar to tell you if you're backing into something. That's a use, but it's a special purpose use of the radio signals to give you that information of the world around you. Well, as we're pushing to new frequencies, new bandwidths, and that's the trick with radar is the frequencies and the physics of what you're using matter for accuracy and kind of position knowledge and depth of information. So as we can use all these, and we now have more compute power because of the softwarization and the use of advanced microelectronics at the radios themselves, you can now listen and tease apart these radio waves that are being used by us for communications, but now they're telling you information about the world around you. So they're basically dual purpose now as sensors of what's happening around us and communication systems. One of the things, and I'm not saying that we're going to solve the current problem, but one of the things we're interested in ISAC for in the DoD is drone detection and traffic management and kind of managing traffic rules by integrating, instead of deploying a whole new sensor network just for that purpose, we're reusing and exploiting the existing infrastructure and using those signals in new and novel ways. This is incredibly exciting from a DoD perspective because sensing is one of our big functions as we use that to inform our decision makers as far as commanding our warfighters. But it's also really concerning because the U.S. and some of our partners and allies are some of the best in the world at building and using and understanding radar theory. If we're pushing sensing into the networks and we're commercializing it, that's going to expose the world to a huge amount of other people now coming up to speed quickly on this technology, and it's no longer a military-specific and unique capability. So that turns into a challenge for us as far as what does that mean for counter operations against our U.S. military forces. So that's what we've got to be able to figure out is what the challenges there are. And last comment on ISAC, the other interesting thing is, well, if you look at the radar theory, and we've been doing that for many decades now in the U.S. DoD. We've got great understanding of radar theory. When you're doing it with all these signals and all these radios and the infrastructure and the base stations everywhere, towers everywhere, all sorts of signals, the only way we're going to make sense of all this is through the use of advanced machine learning and artificial intelligence. So now you're going to start to exploit that. And again, with the proliferation of that technology, it starts to open up new avenues of, again, opportunities for us in the DoD, but potential threats that we've got to be able to understand and figure out how to manage and counter.
Yeah, that's really useful. Thank you so much, Simon. And yeah, drone detection I know is hot in the news from a domestic standpoint and is always very important in your world too. So yeah, if I have it right, you're essentially using the signal both to connect devices and then acting like radar to sense the world around you, which sounds very dual use and both an opportunity and potentially a threat. So before going in a different direction, Nate, I was going to ask if you wanted to come in on any of the points that Tom raised, or if you have other thoughts on the technology of 6G we haven't explored yet.
Yeah, thanks. Honestly, I think Tom put it very well. Definitely for ISAC framed that up incredibly well. So nothing to follow there. But I think, looking at it at a high level, one thing I've kind of thought about as we look at, it's as much 6G as just kind of the evolution of communication in general, is that we're really seeing a convergence of other fundamental technologies kind of coming into this area. We touched on applying kind of modern software practices into the infrastructure, which is huge. Tom, very accurately mentioned AI. AI being in play. I was reading an article a couple of months ago where the AI company Anthropic was in the news, stating as much, saying telco is an area where we could benefit. AI can be used anywhere from customer service, spectral and energy management, operational efficiency can be really huge. Other foundational technologies we've talked about, the space economy as well. With access to space getting more prevalent and easier to achieve and to afford, you're seeing the proliferation of communication up there. I think we're in this very interesting space where you've got all these fundamental technologies that are maturing kind of on their own trajectory, and then they can come into the communication space. I think that's a very interesting artifact that we're kind of looking at right now, and is an accelerant, as we project into the future.
Yeah, just to wrap up on that is you're right. It's converging there, but the communications networks are a means to an end, right? They're not the end in themselves. And so as they're tying into more things and combining them together, you're creating these new opportunities and kind of a force multipliers because of that interconnectivity. So it's infrastructure. It happens to be very complicated and hard to manage infrastructure, but that's what it's there for, is to enable new applications and new ideas for once people start to get their hands on them and understand what they can do for them.
Yeah, just to double click on that, you're absolutely right. That's something else we think about. It's technology's cool. We like technology, but at the end of the day, it has to make sense, mm-hmm. right? And it has to have a use. And we've talked about providing service to consumers. It also has to make sense for operators, right? Whether that's going to reduce their costs or make
mm-hmm.
Make their lives easier in some way. So that it really is the thing to look at is, it seems like there's abundant technology. Now, how does it practically, kind of merge into the industry in a way that benefits, one of those sides?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to take us in a bit of a different direction. Early on, Tom, you brought up Huawei. So I remember around 2018, as cell carriers around the world were making decisions on which companies were going to supply their networks, whether it was Ericsson, Nokia, Samsung, or largely Huawei. Telecom networks became front and center in geopolitics. And maybe as the headlines have receded a bit in the past couple of years, I know that this has stayed a focus for the U.S. government. We've done a lot on trusted networks, whether it's Clean Network Initiative, the Digital Connectivity and Cybersecurity Partnership. But Tom, as someone who has to care deeply about the networks and suppliers that you rely on, can you give us a sense of where things stand today? And then, as we approach 6G deployment, are we likely to see a repeat of the same arguments we saw last time around, or maybe expect something different?
Probably a little the same and a lot of different discussions that are going to happen around 6G. And you mentioned, there was this 2018 is right time period for when it was part of the geopolitical landscape, and we're doing all sorts of conversations about what is the security of these networks, the value of them, the future of them. I think you're seeing the same thing happening right now after what we call Salt Typhoon, and the hacking into our telecommunications infrastructure. So this again shows us how important this is as this critical infrastructure, and how even making the best of decisions as we could as far as vendor selection, we didn't modernize enough, and there's still a lot of security issues that we've got to deal with. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that continuing to happen. And as we're learning how important, and as we're creating more dependence on these networks, they're going to come under farther attack, and we've got to be able to address those as well. So security has been a huge part of the portfolio of my office, to try to understand the nature of these systems and how the new technologies address certain security issues. So we've been going down that path pretty well. We've also been working alongside our friends in the Department of State and Department of Commerce and elsewhere, as we go around the world talking to other countries to try to make sure that they understand the value of these other technologies and the challenges or the problems with what we call untrusted vendors such as Huawei and ZTE. Now, those conversations are helped because we've been investing in what we call Open RAN. And just for real fast, RAN stands for Radio Access Network. This is really what you would think of as the base station. Like that, when you see those white boxes on towers and rooftops, that's the antenna units and the radios that make up the base station. But the base station, the RAN, is the biggest complexity and one of the biggest costs of running these wireless networks. And they have been dominated by what we call the hens, Huawei, Ericsson, Nokia, Samsung, and to some extent ZTE. They keep kind of trying to play a bigger role here. And we in the U.S. can only use Ericsson, Nokia, and Samsung because of our bans on Huawei and ZTE for valid reasons. So those three have, and really in the U.S. it's a lot of Ericsson and Nokia, so there's kind of a duopoly in the market. They're also friends of mine. There's nothing wrong with an Ericsson or Nokia. They actually make incredible equipment and they're doing really innovative stuff. But we did need to change the market shape a little bit, and so we went in with, again, the interagency, cross-state and commerce, with the National Security Council, working on Open RAN and funding efforts to advance Open RAN so that you break open these proprietary boxes that make up the complexity of the network, and then you allow people to explore and create opportunities to innovate inside of these RANs. And so there's multiple pieces now that come together and fit together. And so now you're incentivizing new markets, you're incentivizing new players, you're incentivizing competition at a level that hadn't happened before. And we're trying to get that over the hump. And the next couple of years are going to be critical in order to make sure that this Open RAN technology gets out there, because now we have more access to secure it, to analyze what's going on there, to observe what's happening, and make it a more attractive and sustainable and secure infrastructure. I'll make a plug for my friends over at the NTIA. They have been doing funding opportunities for Open RAN systems. They just announced the first part of so they've had two award cycles out so far. Just recently announced winners of the second award cycle, and just today they published their what they call a NOFO, a Notice of Funding Opportunity. So NOFO 3 is on the street now for people to get money from the government to help them advance their commercial technologies and bolster up this new Open RAN market. So those are all the things that are happening that create the complexity of my job, but those are big opportunities for us to secure these systems in the future.
Yes. And for listeners, I should clarify that we're recording in mid-December, but please definitely check out those resources that Tom just referenced.
Right. Thanks for reminding me.
No, all good. And of course,
we got the time warp of the podcast.
Yes, but you brought up a couple great points. I want to hit on that point of competition and new players, because we're approaching the end of the podcast. I'm getting hustled along, and we haven't yet spoken about startups, which would be a cardinal sin for the IQT podcast. So telecom, Nate, it's an area that's notorious for being full of big incumbents. I know you're out there talking to startups every day who are working in this area. So what do you hear from them, and where do you think there are opportunities for them to make an impact?
Yeah, good question. And I'd say historically, being honest, it's a pretty tough space for startups. The VC money hasn't been super eager to crowd into this area. So, it makes it tough. Upgrade timelines are very long. We touched on that. Hopefully the software efforts will improve that. And there is a lot of incumbency, these big players that dominate. So if you're a startup going into the telco space, it's not for the faint of heart. But lucky for us, there are a lot of startup founders that are just that. They're not faint of heart. They're persistent, and there are several companies that are going for it. And what I think is exciting right now, and that kind of started with 5G, is that while the telco market is one that's filled with incumbency and can be slow moving, we've seen historically that there are opportunities where kind of bursts of innovation can kind of overcome that incumbency for a period. And those are the opportunities to look for. Tom just talked about ORAN, opening up the stack, the ability to create software, with AI and the space economy and all these things, like that opportunity is coming. We think there's opportunities for startups to form and say, I'm a startup in the telco space, right? And I'm going for it. There's also opportunities for startups that are possibly working on adjacent technologies to kind of come over and find opportunity in the telco space, like the Anthropic example we gave earlier. And so, that's kind of what we've been looking for when we talk with these companies. We kind of see what they're building, what they're going at, and honestly, what is the experience like? Trying to penetrate this market. So time will tell. Again, just kind of summarizing, historically tough market, but there are opportunities, and I'm personally pretty excited right now that we think this convergence of technologies in the direction of 5G leading into 6G will create these opportunities. So we're kind of excited.
Awesome. Well, optimistic note to end on. But before we do that, Tom, wanted to give you the last word. So anything else you'd like to leave our listeners with on 6G, DoD, or how to go deeper into the world of communications tech?
Yeah, there's, as Nate just mentioned, there's huge opportunities that are coming around here. And it is a lot of that softwarization, opening these things up. Now it's software programmable, and we can create apps that control the networks. And so there's huge opportunities for things like spectrum management in these networks, more so than we've ever seen before. And again, spectrum is crowded. It's very expensive, and it's highly prized. So anything you can do there is a benefit to the market, and there should be some money to be made in creating better opportunities there. Energy efficiency is another opportunity, driving power consumption down of these systems. Huge opportunities there. And then, so that's within the Open RAN system itself. External to that, as we're pushing this as the kind of core technology that's going to enable all the cool 6G things, now you have a better opportunity to explore ways to use these networks in a more novel fashion. You get to control them, and you get to sample the data out of them more so than you typically can do in these bigger proprietary systems. So that's, again, the data and analytics and analysis. How is that going to play into the use of these systems for new ideas for how we go about creating these new markets? Each one of these, I'm talking in a way about the commercial technology and the commercial opportunities here. Each one of those has a corollary to what we need to do in the DoD, the military. Every time I talk about power efficiency, I'm also talking about fewer batteries, less fuel, management of our generators in the field. That's huge for our military service members. I'm talking about spectrum management. We operate in contested environments. We have jamming happening in the field. You can read a lot about that, what's happening in Ukraine. Those types of things have direct relationship to what we need in the DoD. So a lot of opportunities to develop, to change where these different market pressures can come from, and therefore open up new opportunities for those. And then that's also going to have a dual use and a benefit to our ability to leverage these technologies, make use of them in the field. There is a shortage of qualified workers in this area. So we have a huge interest in the workforce development, and we need to do workforce development across a large number of capabilities within the telecommunications sector, from how do you deploy a network, to how do you debug it and keep it running, to how do you invent the next architectures, to how do you create the next materials and semiconductor materials to drive these systems forward. But now we also have that opportunity for new applications management and smart people and smart things to manage these networks. So it's a pretty exciting time, as you just said. I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to start understanding this and really making use of it to solve real problems.
All right. Well, I think that's an awesome note to end on. Thank you both, Dr. Tom Rondeau and Dr. Nate Roberts. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into today's episode of IQT Explains on the IQT Podcast. Please make sure to subscribe to the IQT Podcast so you don't miss out on future episodes. Feel free to leave us a review or comment. Let us know what you think or what future episodes you'd like to see cover. I also encourage you to check out IQT's website at www.iqt.org to explore more blogs, podcasts, things of that nature, learn about IQT's global investment platform and our work to accelerate groundbreaking tech to enhance the national security of America and its allies. So thanks so much for listening. And Tom and Nate, thanks again for a great conversation.
Thanks for having me.